Okay, everyone, I think we'll get going for today. Hi, everybody. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land from which I join you today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to the Yugara and Turrbal peoples, their ancestors and their descendants, and their enduring cultural and spiritual connections to country. I would like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands from which each of you are joining us today. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Welcome, everybody, to the second lecture in the 2025 People, Plants and the Law online lecture series. My name is Sruthi Balaji, and I am very pleased to welcome you all here today. One of the aims of the series is to bring together personal historical reflections from a group of important figures working on people, plants, and the law. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work happening currently in the area. 2025 marks the fourth year of the People, Plants and the Law series, and you can find all the recordings from previous year's lectures on the series website, and that is where the recordings from this year's lectures will also be uploaded. If you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the comments as we go through the talk today, and we'll do our best to get to them after the talk. So in today's lecture, we are once again showcasing some of the most exciting and interesting work being undertaken in the space. Dr. Susannah Chapman is a lecturer in sociocultural anthropology at University College Cork. Trained as an environmental and legal anthropologist, she has a keen interest in plant-human relations, food systems, and environmental governance. Her work asks questions about the signification and care of plants, but also the coloniality, biopolitics, and translational practices of contemporary efforts to regulate, conserve, and transform plant life, including trees. Today, we are very lucky to have Susannah speak to us on reimagining reproduction in intellectual property law, proprietary fruits, and the making of botanical kinds, where Susannah will explore the work required to make an already existing variety grow into its varietal image year after year, and in doing so, explore the work of making that comes after creation of new botanical kinds. I'll now hand over to Susannah to take us away.
Thank you for that introduction, Shruti. I will go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Whoops. Okay, can everybody see my screens? On my screen? There we are. Okay. So first thing first, I would like to say thank you to Sruthi and Carol and Phoebe and Brad Sherman as well for inviting me to give this talk today. I know many of you from my long time at the University of Queensland, so it's nice to kind of be back in this space, kind of sharing some of the thinking I've been doing on research I did while I was at UQ. So I would like to highlight as well that the research I'm talking about today is based off of an ARC funded project, a DECRA I did while at UQ, and was also funded in part by the University of Queensland. So what I'm going to talk about today is a chapter from a book being put together by Helen Curry called Seed Senius. So this chapter is kind of currently under review, and the point of that collection is to kind of think through to expand the field for thinking about the different kinds of participants, labors, and agencies that are involved in the breeding and emergence of new botanical kinds. So, and in thinking through in that particular chapter, one of the things I'm exploring is the kind of rise of proprietary agricultural supply chains in Australia, and particularly the rise of brand name fruits. So one of the key kinds of shifts that's happened in these supply chains is that we see the production of fruit and the inextricably tied to, or the kind of enforcement of, or the generation of profit, for plant variety protection, inextricably tied to the seasonal production of brand compliant fruit. So this talk, as Shruti mentioned, explores all of the work that's required to take this kind of this plant that already exists as a variety according to the law, and grow into its varietal image year after year. So I have come to think of this as kind of a dialectic between brand specifications and botanical kinds as they are defined under plant variety protection. Now, there's a lot that I could talk about here about this is kind of an emerging field, like frontier of commodification, and I will touch on that insofar as this kind of these new kinds of spaces of propertization really carry concerns about the reproduction of botanical kinds into the realm of like concerns about the production of fruits themselves. And I'll explain kind of more what I mean by that in a minute. But exploring these kind of new spaces where plant owners are no longer concerned just about like the unauthorized propagation, but also about non-compliant cultivation, opens up room for reflection on when and how botanical kinds emerge in the world beyond acts of biophysical reproduction. So in following this creative work of growing brand compliant crop varieties, this talk shows how emerging intellectual property arrangements are reworking, in some ways, the very distinction between reproduction and production upon which they depend. And such a reimagining opens up space to consider, however narrowly, within this kind of new field of this new space of commodification, the ways that plant reproduction and reproduction more broadly is always enmeshed in wider social, ecological, and techno-scientific relations. Oops. Oh dear, why can't I? There we are. So over the past several decades, many fruit breeding programs in Australia, but also in other parts of the world, have started to commercialize intellectual property protected varieties via what are sometimes called closed-loop marketing systems or club systems. Now, and you can see kind of on this schema on the left, an application made to the ACCC or the ACCC for the kind of creation of one of these club systems. Now, these club systems or closed loop systems are arrangements in which a proprietary variety, so one that's usually protected by plant variety protection or some other form of like plant intellectual property, where this variety is produced by a small group of select farmers who in turn sell their harvest to a single commercial firm, which in turn coordinates marketing and sales to wholesalers like a large grocery store. And now all the relationships that are part of producing fruit for market in these supply chains are mediated by contract. And this contractual leverage is made possible by different kinds of intellectual property. So specifically, plant variety protection grants the variety owner the ability to control the types of relations that subtend the life of the proprietary plant from root to fruit. So while trademark provides a kind of tool then for building the markets into which these proprietary fruits will be contractually produced and sold. So in these systems, okay, there we are. For some reason, I'm having some troubles with getting with my PowerPoint, but I will get there and I will, this will get sorted eventually. So in these systems, royalties are often collected in two ways. So there's royalties on the sale of kind of the reproducible tree to farmers. And this is usually a kind of a one-off royalty paid at the time of purchase. And then there's also royalties on the wholesale of brand compliant fruit, usually to the market. Now, I wanted to just highlight a couple of things. The royalties of fruit of the harvest, basically, to market can be calculated in a number of ways. Sometimes it's calculated by box or by piece or by weight, sometimes even by land area. There's lots of different royalties arrangements in these systems. And actually, a lot of these supply chains have played around with different royalty arrangements, kind of trying to tinker with what worked well for farmers and keeps people happy, and balancing kind of different kind of factors in deciding what to do. I also want to highlight that oftentimes, but not always, this fruit is literally like non-reproductive. And by that, I mean it's not reproductive of the varietal kind itself. So for example, with apples, apples tend to not come true from seed. So you actually, you have interestingly like a concern about the form of an apple or but even though the apple isn't necessarily itself a form of propagating material. Similarly with some of the mango supply chains I've looked at, they haven't always been mangoes that would come true from seed if you were to plant that mango in your backyard. And in that case, particularly too, plant owners have talked about this kind of, this is like a slightly added protection to controlling propagation, even in these kinds of, amongst the consuming public. So many different factors are taken into account in assessing farmers for entry into these club systems. So some of these include whether or not the farmer is a commercial orchardist. They would always almost have to be. So you can't just become a club grower with your backyard garden. So particularly in being a commercial orchardist, there's farmers have to demonstrate that they have the capacity to produce to sufficient scale as dictated by like the plan for the club, like targeted production targets and whatnot. Also, they have to demonstrate often that their land has appropriate growing conditions for the variety. They also often have to kind of show to produce other measures of the land in the course of making an application to the club. So this concludes like GPS coordinates, land titles, soil tests, et cetera, et cetera. Once a farmer gains entry into a club, they are also if usually issued a license. Now, grower licenses may specify the number of trees that the farmer can plant, how and to whom the harvest will be sold, and any contract-based details about specifications of production. Standards of production in these cases generally include stipulations about best horticultural practices. Some of these best practices are industry-based, so across the board based on supermarket standards. Some are also variety-specific based on kind of the research that had been done in the course of production and producing these varieties to look like to appear and to in a particular way at harvest. So these kinds of best practices can concern the nature and timing of chemical treatments, for example, given at almost all stages, including prior to bud break and after harvest, for example. They can include stipulations about pruning techniques, thinning patterns for both flowers and fruit, the timing of the harvest, and other kind of variety-specific problems based on whether the variety is prone to producing like a waxy coating on its skin at a certain point in time, et cetera, et cetera. It can also include other kind of variety-specific specifications can include kind of measures to reduce the appearance of certain kinds of lintels and things on the skin at harvest, depending on the fruit we're talking about. So meeting these standards is vital to production of premium fruit that can be sold under the brand name. Fruit that fails to meet top specifications not only fetches a lower price on the market, but it may be cut out of the branded purview entirely to be sold under a different name altogether. So some of this kind of fruit that doesn't meet these specifications can end up in like frozen foods or juices. It can go into other kinds of bulk processing. But it wouldn't be sold in this kind of into this kind of under this brand into this brand market. Now, while there is leeway for events and condition beyond a grower's control, if growers fail to comply with production specifications and agreed marketing arrangements, grower agreements can be terminated, and even in some cases, established orchards can be pulled from the ground. So there's actually like within these clubs, there's often a kind of heavy emphasis. You can see kind of in this quotation here of this farmer talking about the kind of being part of the club as this a collaborative kind of almost disciplined kind of project to meet these kinds of brand specifications. Where farmers don't meet these kinds of expectations, both within that are both kind of social, I think, and also like legal in that they're contractually required to do it. They can actually have their contracts terminated, and in some cases, orchards can be pulled from the ground. So in this sense, like thinking about the sale of trees, the one-off sale to trees to farmers at the start of like entry into the club should probably be kind of taken lightly. So as one owner put it to me, growers have never been sold planting material. All they have is the license to use it. So in this regard, under these new closed loop arrangements, gaining access to a proprietary variety looks less like purchasing a plant and more like leasing a tree, no matter how many roots those trees put down in a farmer's orchard. So significantly, maintaining access to that lease then requires that growers consistently produce fruits to the varietal specifications and brand specifications outlined in grower contracts and in other kinds of spaces, like I'll show you in a second, just in like in looking at kind of growing specifications more broadly. So let's see here. So this is kind of a new frontier in the ownership of botanical kinds. For much of the 20th century, under conventional models of plant variety protection, the plant owner only had a say in how the reproductive material of the varieties that they owned was accessed, shared, and exchanged. Thus, for long-lived tree crops like apples or nectarines, if a farmer or a home gardener bought a proprietary variety, the purchase may have been accompanied by warning labels that reproduction of the tree via grafting was an infringement. And I just pulled this one off Facebook. I used to actually have a collection of these that I carried with me because I find them fascinating, that I've just kind of accumulated over time from my own plant kind of proclivities. I've lost them in some of my moves, but I pulled this one off of off of Facebook, of a plant group on Facebook with people wondering what in the world was going on. And so those are not my captions on the label. But in this kind of older model where people who purchased the plant would have been kind of warned against propagation, there would have been little oversight as to how the tree itself was cultivated, how the fruit was produced, or where the fruit was sold. By comparison, you can kind of see this chart on the right outlining like what the fruit should and shouldn't look like in the course of producing these brand name varieties, right? So you can here in these systems, in these closed loop systems, plant variety owners now also have an interest and a say in how the fruit is produced, how the fruit appears, and where the fruit goes, and the extent to which the harvested fruit corresponds to the ideal varietal type. So in this system, the ability to control and profit from the reproduction of the variety has effectively expanded to encompass the ability to control and profit from varietal production, like varietal cultivation in the sense of like agricultural production. So, so here I suggest that with the extension of new proprietary concerns into the domain of crop production, intellectual property law is reworking its own long-standing distinction between the creation of new botanical kinds and the mere reproduction or copying of already existing varieties. So I want to spend a little bit of time working through what this distinction is, partly because the idea of reproduction as used in English is itself very expansive and complex, but also because this is a distinction with which intellectual property has long grappled. So in English vernacular, the conceptual relationship between production and reproduction is not exactly one of alterity. As historian Ludmila Jordanova has observed, the very concept of reproduction as it is deployed in English came into use in the late 18th century alongside the formation of economic thought around production and exchange. So this was a period when new ideas about humankind and social difference were taking shape in Europe alongside the professionalization of the biological and social sciences. And alongside the rise of liberal political thought, theories of life and living kinds were increasingly tied to emerging theories of economic production and exchange. So amid these new biological and economic conceptualizations, reproduction came to connote both the making of copies in the sense of kind of mechanical manufacture and the generation of potential new kinds, as in the course of biological reproduction. As such, to the extent that reproduction can encompass seemingly divergent notions of sameness and distinctness, growing and making, in English, it also incorporates and is incorporated into notions of production. So production may thus entail reproduction, as within the sphere of intellectual property, where the production of a form, like a machine or a seed, is seen to reproduce an image or intangible, like the specifications of the machine, or in this case, the plant variety, which is, as Brad Sherman has shown, has always got this materiality to it. So within this very realm, reproduction may also be conceived as a form of production in and of itself, particularly in cases where the biological facts of life's generativity are seen as producing a new living kind in the process of conception and reproduction. In this case, for plants, it would be like cross-pollination or mutagenesis. So this tension is particularly consequential for the distinction between reproduction and production within plant intellectual property law. As Brad Sherman has shown, questions about the difference between creation and copying and invention and discovery have been central to discussions over whether plants constitute allowable subject matter within intellectual property law. This was partly due to the secretive nature of plants, where it was impossible for breeders to explain the reason for transformation in botanical kinds. This meant that the inventive actions of humans were harder to identify. In arguing for intellectual property protection, breeders in the early 20th century turned to showing all the different ways that the breeding process is creative, experimental, and scientific. And in the model of plant invention that took shape, as Brad Sherman notes, nature and breeders emerged as kind of joint inventors, where nature, through the creativity of the reproductive process, generates new botanical kinds in the process of biological reproduction. And where breeders, through the identification, isolation, and propagation of this new variation, make it available to others. And notably, this is also an act of reproduction, albeit one that is selective, identificatory, and cultivating. So we see this kind of generative biophysical reproduction as involved in this process, but also this kind of techno-legal propagating reproduction, both of which are kind of seen to establish and isolate a new botanical form. Now, in other words, there's this kind of dual account of reproduction embedded in the very notion of plant invention under intellectual property law. What is key is that different kinds of human and other than human reproductive acts are seen to generate this originary form. Significantly, this generative and creative reproduction has often been distinguished from the mere copying reproduction entailed in agricultural production, such that after the variety is bred or born and authored into the world, it is effectively reproduced or cultivated unless and until it is bred into something different. So cultivation here is generally not envisaged as a creative or generative act, but a reproductive or copying one. Instead, it is only in certain moments of plant reproduction where there is a botanical shift in the progeny that is deemed sufficient to create this kind of break in botanical kind, that the copying reproduction of cultivation is kind of reclassified as a creative or productive act of breeding. So it is this distinction between generative and copying reproduction within the law that makes it possible to claim that a farmer saving seed of a protected variety of plant, for example, is merely reproducing and thus potentially infringing another person's plant invention. It's also this distinction between production and reproduction that has underwritten many classic accounts of plant breeding, where a variety is imagined to be bred and then released to farmers for cultivation. So I want to pause here and note that this distinction between kind of generative and copying reproduction is not the only way to imagine the work that happens after bred, quote unquote, bred varieties are released into the world. So anthropologists working with peasant farmers in many different parts of the world, myself included, have long pointed to how such farmers often acknowledge the creativity inherent in cultivating acts. So drawing on kind of thinking with some of my other work that I do work also in West Africa, farmers often talk about exceptional acts of tending, and this is just like what would otherwise be described as cultivation, like exceptional acts of tending become like grounds for renaming varieties after certain people. Similarly, exceptional acts of distribution are also talked about with this kind of creative force that differentiates and is the variety, but also creates new kinds of attachments between people and plants. As the anthropologist Tim Ingold has noted, in such cases, farmers and gardeners often describe the emergence of new botanical kinds, not in terms of breeding or making, but in terms of growing or raising children. So a key difference between these descriptions of making plants and raising children is that whereas accounts of breeding and making kind of foreground a creative rupture that produces a new identity, accounts of raising varieties, like raising children, foreground a more distributed process of relational becoming. So to bring Marilyn Strathern's insights about the relational person into the realm of the botanical, if people raise varieties like they raise children, the identity of botanical kinds only emerges within a wider relational field that extends beyond birth. This includes the relations entailed in biological reproduction and genealogical descent, but also relations of cultivation and kind of mere acts that would otherwise be mere reproduction or cultivating like mundane acts. So even within the history of plant intellectual property, I think there are some examples where the potential generativity of copying reproduction is entertained in deliberations over the law. And so I'm thinking here specifically of the critic of the Plant Patent Act, Joseph Rossman, that Brad talks about in his book, Intangible Intangibles. So in a critique of the Plant Patent Act, Rossman pointed to the changeability of plants as compared to other kinds of non-living subject matter. And not only did plants vary by the environment in which they were grown, Rossman pointed out, but even generations of grafted trees could change in kind. So Rossman wrote, it is, quote, "It is impossible to determine whether a Baldwin apple is like the original Baldwins that grew on the first tree of that variety when it was discovered in 1793. So Rossman here is highlighting that the generational and intergenerational changeability of plants to argue against the protection of plant subject matter. Yet his points nonetheless highlight a wider field within which plant kinds emerge, morph, and change. So I now want to kind of, So I now want to kind of turn to some examples of how this kind of creation copying distinction is both maintained within closed loop supply chains and challenged by those the activities that are ongoing in those supply chains. Specifically, though this distinction between creation and copying is largely maintained within claims for plant variety protection, the very brand aspirations that make the plant variety protection more profitable also foreground how post-breeding cultivation matters for the generation or achievement of botanical kinds. So a key feature of this dynamic is the relationship between the variety contracted to farmers and that brand image that they are also required to meet from season to season as best they can. So a great deal of work goes into producing a variety according to the specifications that come according to these brand specifications. And my argument here is that within these supply chains, this is a form of work that opens up a more expansive process of the generative reproduction of botanical kinds. So set against the drama of trying to achieve a brand name ideal, generative work beyond crossing, selection, and identification of new botanical kinds foregrounds this wider socio-ecological and techno-legal field in which botanical kinds take shape after birth. So case in point, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to follow one particular variety of club apple that was bred by the Department of Agriculture and Food of Western Australia. So this variety, it is the variety ANAB P01, and it is marketed under the name Bravo. So many of you might know it, and it is owned by the Western Australian Agricultural Authority. So all of the material from here on out, I've been doing research across lots of different kinds of club supply chains. So all of the kind of material I'm presenting from here on out about Bravo is from a publicly available sources and so I'm using this as an exemplar of kind of common practices within closed loop supply chains more broadly. So by many accounts, the story of Bravo maintains the distinctions between generative reproduction and copying reproduction that are central to intellectual property law. So one of the prime ways of establishing this distinction is via genealogy and breeding history. So the variety ANAB PA01 is the result of a 1992 cross between Cripps Red and Royal Gala. And this history is outlined in the application for plant variety rights. It is also reproduced within the somewhat wider family tree in one of the technical dossiers for growers who are considering coming into the club and who are needing to understand what would be required of them in their cultivation practices to produce this variety as Bravo. So you can see this, this excerpt of this family tree here in this slide. Now, a description of the variety also follows the family tree, and it relays the specifics of tree growth, including the shape of the tree, the expected kind of wood color and the shoot thickness of the tree, leaf shape, flowering period, fruiting habit, and harvest time. And it details averages on the shape, skin color, flesh color, the size of the fruit, and the sugar content of the fruit. So it presents this picture of the variety in all of this kind of very specific detail about its distinct qualities. Likewise, as in all applications for plant variety rights, in the Western Australian Agricultural Authority had to provide documentation of varietal distinctness as compared to other known apple varieties. So in the published plant variety application, images of the deep burgundy ANAB PE1 fruits are sitting next to the bright red fruits of the comparator variety Crips Red. And this is partly a visual indicator that ANAB PE1 is already a distinct identifiable entity based on its breeding and selection. So you can see that here on the right-hand side of the screen. These differences between Crips Red and ANAB PE1 are further elaborated in a table that follows this image, where characteristics that distinguish the variety ANAB PE1 from Crips Red are charted out. So these are characteristics where there are deemed significant differences in the two varieties. So for Crips Red and ANAB PE1, these include fruit size, the over color of the skin, the thickness of the stalk of the fruit, and the time of flowering, among other kinds of qualities. And then this kind of gross characteristics chart is then followed by kind of statistical measures of these different kinds of qualities between the two fruits. The pervading sense within the application is that the variety, based on its breeding, possesses innate characteristics that make it grow, appear, taste, and behave in particular ways. This is a reminder that the identity of the variety, which might be reproduced clonally, is seen to inhere in certain kind of intrinsic qualities born of biological kinds and genealogical connections. So here, if breeding is figured as a kind of creative process that precedes the release and cultivation of a variety to farm, or the release of variety to the farmers and its cultivation by those farmers, it is also a definition, by definition, a process that has been concluded, right? So the breeding is seen to be done. Now it's ready for release. The variety is identified as distinct. It is named and identified and ready for release. The variety, there's a sense in which the variety is what it is, and others may merely lease the right to grow it. Yet the existence of Bravo, the brand, inflects instructions about how to cultivate ANAB PE1 with a sense that a variety is not something that is just bred and born, but is something achieved in the act of cultivation. So for example, the authors of ANAB PE1's technical dossier note that after the first flowering in mid-spring, the trees will set a second round of flowers that grow out from the already ripening primary fruit cluster. So if left intact, these secondary flowers that are also known as rat tails will produce an, quote, elongated, dense, and less sweet fruit. The dossier authors describe these secondary fruits as quote, not typical of ANAB PE1, even though ANAB PE1 trees will produce these fruits if left to their own devices. Because these different kind of later fruit are less appealing in the marketplace, the official recommendation for farmers is that secondary flowers, quote, must be removed either at blossom time or at thinning. Thus, even as the dossier presents the origin of ANAB PE1 as this kind of classic story of plant genealogy and breeding, it begins to point to some of the ways in which acts of post-breeding cultivation, of kind of rearing plants, like maybe rearing children, such as thinning, are central to the making of both the variety ANAB PE1 as this kind of not typical, what is typical of the variety or what is not typical of the variety, but it also then becomes very, very important for the production of these large non-reproductive fruit that are sold under the Bravo brand. So a long list of other cultivation practices can be added to this one, this kind of the thinning of these rat tails, for example. So Bravo's uniquely deep color, which is one of the qualities that sets it apart as a distinct variety in its plant variety protection application, develops because of fluctuations in diurnal temperature and sufficient sun exposure. So as such, it is recommended that farmers prune for an open tree structure and thin fruit on ripening clusters to allow for sufficient sunlight, which in turn produces the uniquely deep red overcolor of the fruit's skin and of these varietal characteristics. Likewise, the variety's unique flavor profile and keeping qualities will also vary depending on when it is harvested and how it is stored. Emergent in this kind of the space between descriptions of ANAB P01 as unique, I'm sorry, emergent in the kind of space between descriptions of the variety's unique identifying varietal qualities and directions to farmers about how to bring those qualities into existence, I argue is an unspoken acknowledgement of the liveliness of the plant amid the creative work of cultivation, of the way in which varieties can never precede their relations, and of how the work of botanical differentiation can extend beyond the confines of the experimental plot. So there is now a vibrant body of work that explores how social descriptors, cultural meaning, and broader politics come to shape the ways that different people identify, understand, and classify botanical kinds. Bravo and other varieties like it are reminders that environments, including the labor regimes of cultivation, are also always generating those botanical kinds within and beyond acts of biophysical and kind of techno-legal plant reproduction. So we can think of any given Bravo apple that you might find in the store as embodying all these relations. So this is my attempt at painting what I could imagine a Bravo apple would look like if we were to look at the relations all of inhered in it. So we can also think of the tree that produces these fruits as also embodying all these relations. So I think there's a sense in which when we're talking about even meeting brand specifications, we're talking about work upon the entire tree, not just the fruit. So ironically, for a legal regime so concerned with the distinction between creation and copying, emerging frontiers of intellectual property seem to be partly revealing the artifice of the idea that botanical kinds are first bred via acts of genetic recombination, named and then released to a farming and eating public. Instead, proprietary fruits point us toward thinking about how botanical kinds are also constantly generated in acts of cultivation and the quest for brand compliance. So here, capitalist enterprises, together with the state, get to blur the very boundaries of creativity and copying that they depend upon for making profit. Now, despite legal and genealogical accounts of ANAB P01's origins, attention to the contractually mediated life of the variety reveals that the genetic recombinations of its ancestry are just part of the story. So not only is ANAB P01 what it is because of its human cultivators out there in the orchard removing rat tails or opening up space to bring in sunlight within the canopy, but ANAB P01 becomes Bravo in how it is cultivated, harvested, stored, and transported. It is a botanical kind of many possible expressions bent through all kinds of generative labor to a particular market ideal. And that is all. So
Thank you so much, Susannah. That was wonderful. I think if everyone would like to join me in giving Susannah a round of applause, that was incredibly thought-provoking. And the way that Susannah thinks about things will never cease to amaze me and conceptualizes, breaks down, and tells a story to us all is incredible. I'd now like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you'd like to put them in the chat, you can, or you're more than welcome to also unmute and raise a question yourself if you'd like to say it, or you can also raise a hand and I can hand it over to you. While everybody gets their thoughts together and gets their questions together, I'm going to take advantage of moderating here to put my questions to Susannah. I think, yeah, that was incredibly fascinating. And there's so much to think about. I think I'm also just curious in the story. of cultivation and reproduction, how you said, and the branding story. I guess what do you see? Do you see trademark sort of influencing this story a lot more than plant variety protection and maintaining varieties? More so, I guess, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but obviously in all those standards and the regime and the way that they come to market, it seemed like branding and trademark was doing a lot of the work. Just curious on your thoughts on plant variety protection versus trademark there.
Yeah, I think trademark is doing a lot of really interesting work here. It's partly though made the leverage that they have to kind of bring farmers into those specifications though. I mean, they're linked to contract and the contracts aren't always, sometimes the contracts can exceed like what plant variety protection allows. So there is, but right. So, but that plant variety protection provides this kind of initial kind of leverage to like get those contracts going, right. And for access and things like that. But yeah, I mean, brands are doing some really interesting things. As far as even just like, there's a sense in which I even think it's fascinating. It's like brand specifications, like the sense in which there is this kind of image with this that now the plant is trying to be made into, and I find that kind of fascinating, given thinking about like the history and thinking with like a lot of Brad's work on the kind of materiality and this kind of more historical description of like plant origins and what the plant is distinct as this kind that already exists in the world. But there is this, so brands introduce this weird kind of possibility, like forward-looking kind of specification that is itself and kind of an image rooted in the certain potentials of botanical kinds, but that are by no means like a given that that's how the botanical kind will necessarily express itself in the world, right? So yes, I think brands are doing lots of kind of legal work in these systems, but also really kind of interesting conceptual work with how they're introducing kinds of this intangible dimension, or is it an intangible? I don't know. I'm still trying to work through, is that an intangible dimension to this kind of otherwise already existing, this material kind of realm? Maybe Brad might have thoughts on, yeah, anyway.
Thank you, Susanna. The chat's filling up, so I'll just turn to them. So we have a interesting question from Kajsa. Your point on the relationality making a distinction between making and nurturing brings to mind things like the European PDO certification with farmer cooperatives rather than clubs. For a buyer, though, the end product might appear quite similar, a fruit of a specific and protected variety, but in reality, quite different. Do you see any interactions between these, i.e., PDOs and club fruits?
This is a really great, I don't know. So protected denomination of origin. So this would be like, I'm just making sure because this is a little bit outside the realm of remit of my knowledge base. So, but this is like a geographical indication and like a group of producers tethered to that. Is that right? Am I right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Um, oh, yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting question. I mean, we're dealing with from the start kind of different forms of intellectual property. Um, I think, and it would depend, like one thing that, and I'm not like, I don't study geographical indications that much. So, but one of the things that strikes me is that you may already have in a GI protected product a very much a recognition of that it is the sense in which it's not necessarily only, it doesn't pre-exist, it's the relations of production of it's not just bred into the world, but it has to be, whether we're talking about a form of cheese or a like a type of wine, right? It has to be produced in a particular way. So there's perhaps maybe there's something about club apples that are looking more like that system. I don't know. That's a really fascinating kind of question, and I would have to kind of reflect more on it because there is something interesting happening there. And I see where those kinds of similarities, you see similarities in those systems.
We've got a question from Jose. So historically, plant variety protection had conflicts with the trademark registries. So I was wondering if you have an idea of whether there is a special relationship between the two.
Jose. um,
Yeah, I
like
was also sorry. I was interested in the idea of brand compliance and what do you mean by that, and whether it's actually being enforced, or people do not care so much, or there's some sort of flexibility. I mean, because even universities have brand compliance brochures for academics, and I don't think that we normally follow that. So I was wondering what you meant by that. That you, while yeah, of course, the brand is basically the aspiration, but to what extent aspiration is monitor, and there is some sort of mechanism to follow that up. Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. That's a that's a kind of a fun thought comparison between academics, adhering to brand compliance, and then farmers. What kind of brand compliance are farmers held to? So, and I think in this particular case, there's a lot of audit across all points of these supply chains. So where like the fruit is sorted and graded and measured and assessed. And yeah, I mean, fruit that doesn't meet specifications, it is not allowed in. Now there is, and so, and and there's lots of ways to trace, like there's fruit that isn't compliant kind of back to certain farmers. Now there's allowances made for like the whims of environment or seasonality. Like some years are just not good, and there's going to be possibly more leeway put into what those specifications are to meet the kind of top fruit in certain supply chains. In other supply chains, there's been cases where, for example, just it can be difficult to always achieve that brand image of the fruit. And so there's actually been, interestingly, like public, kind of more public campaigns to educate the public about how that fruit still tastes as good, even though it doesn't look exactly like its brand image. So there is this kind of interface, but there between like what the image is and how it can be achieved. But there is lots of auditing across those supply chains. And yeah, farmers do lose contracts. You can in certain supply chains, and I'm not specifically talking about Bravo here. I'm just talking broadly about across all of these together. Yeah, like people can have their orchards ripped out if you're not meeting those specifications to the brand in the production process.
Thank you.
And we've got potentially a final question here from Elsinore. I was especially struck by the notion of the cultivation of varieties being like raising children. It reminds me of the book Beyond Nature and Culture, Philip Discola, that talks about the divide between nature and culture being very different for a lot of peoples. How would worldview of a very different understanding of what culture means and nature relate to the entire debate about intellectual property? Is this something you have considered too?
Wow, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense in which a lot of critiques of intellectual property coming from peasant farmers are often are pointing to, in different ways, the creativity inherent in these kinds of cultivating acts. They're talking acts that would otherwise not necessarily put on the register of like appear on a register of transforming nature, because in the way that nature already exists, they're actually pointing to, no, this is a relational process. So yeah, I think there's lots of order worldview are very different. I'm sorry, I'm rereading your question. I think, I mean, central intellectual property deals with questions of nature and culture in a very specific way, and that, and it doesn't always align with how other people think about what nature and culture is particularly in the context of, say, like plant variety protection or the emergence of new botanical kinds. I also do think, though, that doesn't preclude, like, it just, one of the things that strikes me about this kind of relationships is that sometimes it's talked about as like the alternative would be like opening up, like if we're to say like this kind of if plants are emerging in these relational contexts, like opening up to these kind of like as an argument strictly against IP is, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. or against any sort of proprietary claim. And I actually think that with kind of following through and looking at, say, the forms of attachment or the signification of like the reproductive work of raising plants like you raise children, actually opens up a field to kind of, thinking about, say, the claims that people might make to plants or not in very interesting and kind of surprising ways. That doesn't just look like against IP or an inversion of what IP is. It just rearranges things, but in a very, very different way. And I'm not the first to say this. I think lots of other people before me have said this in many different forms. And I think a lot specifically here too of Marilyn Strathern's work on, say, like, what is intellectual property after, and kind of thinking about how intellectual property cuts and rearranges networks in specific ways, even though other people, in thinking about, say, the cuts and connections born of kinship, say, also rearrange networks in different ways.
Well, I think that might be all for today. Before we close, I just want to say another huge thank you to Susannah for not only a wonderful and incredibly engaging talk, but also waking up so early on such a busy day. So if we can all give another round of applause, that'd be wonderful. And thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you in the next seminar in a few weeks. Thank you, everyone.